Imagine taking attendance in a class like this. You're looking around, you're calling students' names, and no one is responding. You say Michael, and Michael doesn't say anything because he's so engulfed in his electronic device. And so, as you take attendance, you recognize that every student is actually present in their seat physically, but mentally they are absent. So there's no box, unfortunately, to check off that says absent presence. And you're probably thinking, well, where did that come from? Those two don't even go together. And you're exactly right. And so this leads us to our discussion today. And we are going to be talking about the oxymoron at work in literature, a case study in Macbeth, a rhetorical occasion. And hi, this is Miss Miller. Welcome to our classroom channel. What's interesting about literature and what I find so fascinating is that not only oxymorons, but we've got metaphors. I think even in Macbeth, specifically, there are over at least 40 different types of rhetorical devices at work in a text. So you can imagine why it is absolutely so challenging to get through and why it's so difficult. So we're just going to touch on one today, which is the oxymoron. But just imagine all of these littered throughout the text, and you're having to dissect all of it and make sense. So just accept the fact that it is going to be a challenge, and the more of the rhetorical devices that you recognize and understand, the better it will be in terms of making sense out of it. So let's take a look at what an oxymoron is. And we all know when we hear something that doesn't go together. And so specifically, an oxymoron is defined as a paradox or a self-contradictory statement reduced to two words. In some cases, two words, usually a noun and an adjective. Not always the case, in which you'll see in our examples today. But the ones that are easier to detect certainly would possess both a noun and an adjective. So what is the purpose? Why would an author even utilize an oxymoron in its work? Well, one is it definitely serves as a mental stimulus. It forces the reader to think about what is being said. Two is oftentimes and on occasion, it can serve to entertain the reader. And perhaps three, the most important, would be it definitely magnifies and inflates a conflict. If there is some sort of issue or problem in the text, an oxymoron is going to bring to light, it's going to enlarge, it's going to draw us closer and make the issue huge. So that's what another purpose for an oxymoron might be in a literature work. The different pieces of the pie, I really like to say these are the qualities that oxymorons possess. How do you know it's an oxymoron? Well, one, there is always an element of truth. So even though they're contradictory, if you dig deep enough, you will see that, wow, this does sort of make sense. Even though at first glance, on the surface level, it appears not to, it certainly does. Another element or piece of the pie, as you say, is that it adds layers to the text. It definitely allows us to develop a more meaningful interpretation of the reading. Another thing you should know about oxymorons, if an author includes it in its work, it's deliberate. They are doing it intentionally. It's on purpose. It's not just something that is gratuitous. It's an intentional and deliberate use of a rhetorical device. And one thing that the use of oxymorons do is it definitely shows that the author has verbal wit. Can you imagine if you're talking, and how many of us really do this? We don't, right? We certainly can detect it, but it does require a lot of verbal wit to be able to integrate or infuse oxymorons in our work. And then the last piece is that, it really does, not only does it add layers, but it makes the work really complex. It makes it very dense to sort of get through, and that's part of the challenge. So, we have this idea of the heroic murder when we look at Macbeth, and he certainly is heroic on occasion, but also he's a murderer, and those two are self-contradictory in and of itself. So that serves also as an oxymoron. However, there are two other rhetorical devices that are very close in terms of they're siblings of the oxymoron, and oftentimes interchangeable. One is the antithesis, and the other is the paradox. And though an antithesis is just the language used to have an opposite effect, and the paradox is a statement that's made that's contradictory. And paradox really is the umbrella in which the oxymoron sort of falls under. So here is the antithesis example in Macbeth. And it's Lady Macbeth, she says, "What hath quenched them hath given me fire." And so it's really hard to even distinguish between the antithesis and the paradox and the oxymoron in a piece of work. But just recognize that the ideas and the work, you're going to see a contradiction, and know that there is an element of truth. You do have to dissect it. You have to stop and break it down. Another example, and this one is of paradox, isn't necessarily from Macbeth, but it is a Shakespeare work, is "to be cruel, to be kind." And so the two, how do you do it? And yes, it is possible. So let's do our case study on Macbeth. And if we look at the text, we see in Act 1, Scene 1, we see the second witch. And one of the things she says is, "When the battle's lost and won." And when you think out of context, you're thinking, lost and won, how is that possible? In my own life, if I lost something, but maybe as a result of that loss, I gained something inevitably, then I could see that. However, in the context of Macbeth, we see, well, his major battles would be the Scottish War, which, he's triumphant, he's the general, he's a leader, right? And then Macbeth also struggles with his mental state, which he is losing at one point, and he loses it altogether, right? He has this mental deterioration or mental breakdown. So we also see another major or primary battle for Macbeth would be the fallen kingdom, and you'll see towards the end what inevitably happens or occurs for him. But lost and won, well, how is that possible? When the battle's lost and won, well, wow, yes, battle, literally the battle in terms of the Scottish War, but figuratively, well, his mental state, and even the fallen of the kingdom. So yes, he has lost and won. We see also in Act 1, Scene 1, the three witches. You often hear this fair is foul and foul is fair, and you're thinking, well, how is that even possible? Well, the corruption inside and outside of the castle walls sort of exude this idea of foul, right? Everything, the witches are foul. Macbeth and Lady Macbeth and their plot to take down King Duncan is foul. Even Macbeth wanting to take out Banquo is foul, right? And everything is foul. The witches are foul. I mean, the only thing, it's foul for a person to take out a king who is virtuous like King Duncan, but it's not foul, it's fair for someone to take out a tyrant. And we know that Macbeth becomes a tyrant, and so that's fair, right? And then we also know that both Lennox and Malcolm, they in the text are the only two who really ultimately are fair, and they try to make sense and be fair. So fair is foul. I mean, it's all just mixed together, and it becomes such a challenge to has the best interest, right, of the kingdom. So we looked again at Act 1. A lot of these oxymorons exist in Act 1, Scene 3. So Macbeth, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen." And if we recall, we have this fair and foul and fear. And I mean, it's a lot, right? So foul and fair. And the first thing you think is, oh my goodness, the alliteration with the sound of the consonant sound of the f, right, in the text. But so foul and fair a day. And we know that, at least we begin to acknowledge that the three witches have the most morbid plans for Macbeth. I mean, they initially tell him he's going to be Thane of Cawdor, he's going to be king, and we in the beginning thought, wow, that's great. This is great news. This sounds fair. However, he has to become foul to be fair, to achieve this. He has to, he takes matters into his own hands, and it's them that sort of is the impetus of his decision to become so foul. Remember, he is a general, and he is a leader, and he's well respected by King Duncan. And then this drive and this ambition, which is sort of fueled by Lady Macbeth, and then ultimately from within himself. Now this fairness is foul. The only way to achieve this fairness is foul, and so foul and fair a day I have not seen. And what's ironic about it is that's all that he experiences from the time he encounters the witches in the text. Again, in Act 1, Scene 3, we see Banquo, and he is actually talking to Macbeth, but this is after he discusses, or after he sort of addresses, or in the context of addressing the witches. And they've just told both Macbeth and Banquo that they, have good fortune, and Macbeth will be king and Thane of Cawdor, but they don't really tell much to Banquo. And so he says, hey, he says to Macbeth, because Macbeth is sort of, if you recall, his reaction to the witches is maybe he's entranced by it, he's speechless, he doesn't really have anything to say. So he says, why do you start and seem to fear? Like things that sound so fair. Here we are with this fear and fair. And so why do you fear it when it seems so good for you, right? You have good fortune. And so perhaps it might foreshadow or give us insight into what may become. We don't know if Macbeth is aware at the moment, like, wow, I fear it because that means that something bad will have to happen to the Thane of Cawdor. And if I'm going to be king, then that means King Duncan is no longer going to be king. He perhaps fears what is to come, right? And even though Banquo perhaps is not privy to the idea that, hey, he is what means he will go, and all means necessary for Macbeth. Again, in Act 1, Scene 3, Banquo says, who neither beg nor fear your favors nor your hate. And of course, he's referring to the witches. And so it sounds like a lot of the oxymorons are centered around these witches. Neither beg nor fear your favors. And there's the favors now is into it, right? We have foul, fair, favors, nor your hate. And so he says, I'm not going to upset these witches, but I'm not going to also, beg for them I'm not going to trust all their good fortune. Like either I can take it or leave it, but I would like to know, neither beg nor fear your favors nor your hate, right? And so we look at Act 1, Scene 4. It says, Lady Macbeth, wouldst not play false, and yet wouldst wrongly win. Gosh, it's like, stumbling over all of these words, right? And then we have this wouldst wrongly win. So alliteration too is coupled with the oxymoron, which makes it even more complex and forces us as a reader to stop and sort of acknowledge what we have just come across, right? And so here is Lady Macbeth, and she's just read this letter from Macbeth, who says, hey, Lady Macbeth, I've just come across the witches, and they have told me that I'm going to be Thane of Cawdor. I'm going to be the king. And as innocent as his letter is, he doesn't think much of it. Of course, Lady Macbeth has, she is ahead of him, several steps ahead, and she thinks, okay, he wants to be king. Wrongly win. However, do you have the guts? She's thinking to herself, does he have the guts to actually go through with this, right? Because if you're going to be king, wrongly win, and you want to be king, the only way to get it is to wrongly win, according to her, right? They have to take matters into their own hand. They can't just allow things to happen. And the witches perhaps even anticipate that this might be their reaction and just play them. And they've played right into it. He says, oh, I'm going to be king. They said this, and, I'm now Thane of Cawdor, so that was true. It's inevitable that I'm going to be king. And Lady Macbeth is, wouldst now play false, right? And how is it possible to play false, not play false, and wrongly win? You want to be king. Well, there's only one way to do that. You've got to take out Duncan. And do you have the courage to do that? Is the play false and then wrongly win. He's got to go. And are you capable of it? And so her ambition sort of sets him up to take action. And then we see later in the text, so, of course, I'm sure there are additional examples of oxymorons, but we see in Act 4, Scene 3, Macduff, and, spoiler alert, right? Macduff takes out the king. And so we know there are 3 kings in this, and, you perhaps question, well, why does Macbeth why is it the play about Macbeth if Macduff reigns in the end? Well, Macbeth is the one who goes through all, who is a tragic hero, so he has to be the center of attention. He rises to his position as king, and of course what always happens is he loses his power. But Macduff, he comes across, I want to say it's Malcolm, and such welcome and unwelcome things at once. So Malcolm is coming to him with all of these things, and we've got to take out Macbeth, and this has to happen, you have to save us, right? And so we know that Macduff will be the one who saves Scotland. So such welcome and unwelcome things. This is a lot, right? I have to do this, but remember, if we recall, it's foul as fair. It's fair to take out a king who is a tyrant, which Macbeth becomes. It's foul, or it's not fair what Macbeth does to King Duncan, because there was nothing wrong with him being king. So this Macduff sort of justifies, he has to reconcile with this. And then scene 3, we're going back, and scene 4, Macbeth, I am bent to know by the worst means the worst for mine own good. And we see some repetition there, but he has to know. He wants to know. I believe he's talking to Lady Macbeth, and he is actually talking to Lady Macbeth in this instance. And right, how can worse be your own good? But he wants to know. He's going to go back to these witches. First, they approached him, and of course, they're probably waiting for him to come. If you recall, they're getting this brew together, and they're putting all of these disgusting parts into their trouble is brewing, right? And so he is determined. I want to go back to these witches. I want to know the worst for mine own good. I need to know. I need to know, because we know that either it's too late for him to change his course of action, but he does attempt. We know in the past he's trying to take fate into his own hands, so perhaps he's going to do the same in this case. So it's only a matter of time before we discover that. So that's what the oxymorons at work look like in literature, a case study in Macbeth, a rhetorical occasion, and I hope that was helpful.